I'm Jen Wilson. I founded Jazz Heritage Wales back in 1986, and what I'm doing this morning is a tour of our Jazz's Diversity exhibition, and the exhibition was put up for the Documenting Jazz Conference 2022. We couldn't survive and we couldn't operate without our volunteers, and this is a panel introducing our volunteers, which are on the pictures here, and Jazz's Diversity, it says. The collection started when Jen wrote to museums and libraries across the UK asking what they had in their collections on women in jazz. And the answer was, we have none. So I thought I'd better start it myself, and that's what I did by interviewing women jazz musicians in Britain. It was much easier to have information about American women than it was about any women in Britain, and obviously women in Wales. You know, Wales was regarded as a net curtain country. Everybody went to chapel on Sundays, and that's how it was regarded by everybody else in the rest of Britain. But in fact, it was Wales that was more multicultural than any other country in Britain, as far as I could see, when I started taking the story back. Anyway, so here we are. We've got the collections comprise of oral histories, and we've done quite a lot of oral histories from 1986 onwards. And the first one I did was this lady up here, which you can see on the top photograph. It's Kathy Stobart. She's a multi-saxophonist. And I asked her if I could talk to her, and she said, I'd be delighted. Nobody asks us to tell us our stories. So the first interview I did with her, we got as far as 1939. And the rest of the time I had to catch up with her, you know, 5 or 6 years later when she came close to Swansea again touring, and I got the rest of her story. And I got another bit of her story. I travelled down to Axminster where she lived, and got the rest of her story down there. She was an absolutely fascinating woman. The woman underneath with oral history is Ottilie Patterson. She sang for many years with the Chris Barber Jazz Band, and then suddenly stopped singing, and I asked if I could interview her, and eventually she got back to me and she said, yes, I'd like to talk to you. And I went up to Ayr in Scotland, where she lived, and stayed 3 days with her. And she slowly let go of her story, which she hadn't told to anybody before. And because of the personal incidents in her story and the reason why she stopped singing jazz in the 1980s, I couldn't use any of her oral history because it was far too personal. So I came back and transcribed her oral history and put it away, and there it stayed for 31 years, until this year when Double Band Films in Belfast contacted me to ask would I contribute to their film about Ottilie Patterson, as she was their local girl, as she was born outside Belfast in Cwmba. Anyway, I agreed, and they made a film, and they interviewed me in the film, and that film is coming out on BBC 4 in February next year. So Ottilie's story is going to be unfolded next year. It's quite, it's an inspiring story in some parts, and quite sad in other parts. And when you interview somebody, it's different. When you interview somebody for a paragraph or an article or a magazine, it's different to when you interview people for an oral history, because an oral history is somebody's life story, and everybody's life is not all roses all the way through. Some have hard times, some bad times, and awful things happen to people. And an oral history gives people the opportunity to say about awful things that have happened to them, as well as the good things. So Otterly's oral history is now safe in the Jazz Archive, and I've interviewed Paula Gardner here on double bass as well, and she came to our conference as the chair of our Jazz is Diversity Documenting Jazz Conference, and I've known Paula during the 80s, and she's now head of jazz at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama, and she's been very supportive of my work all the way along. And I first met Paula when she asked me to play in her band in Cardiff, and the band was called The Last of the Brownies, which I'd forgotten all about until now. In the jazz collections as well, we have 27 stage gowns. Some of the ones are up on the wall here, and we've got our oldest dress that we've got is an Asian dance dress, which is up on the top there, and it dates back to 1900. And a colleague of mine called Tanji Wilson, no relation. Tanji was a touring guitar player and had gone out to India to play her own songs and to meet up with other musicians. And there was a young woman dancing in this gown. I don't know where it was in India, I've forgotten. And the young lady dancing was eyeing Tanji's guitar, and Tanji was eyeing the woman in the dance dress. And the Indian lady said to Tanji, do you want to sell me your guitar? And Tanji said, well, I quite fancy your dress. Shall we swap? So they swapped a guitar for the Asian dance dress, and Tanji eventually gave the dance dress into our collection. So that was a nice little story. And the gown we have here is Dame Cleo. Dame Cleo Lane is our patron. And the actual gown you can see is on the other side of the room here. And this blue sparkly one belongs to Dame Cleo Lane. And this is the gown she wore in Carnegie Hall in the 1970s. So we're very grateful to Dame Cleo for giving us the gown. And these two gowns here, the middle one is from Blanche Finley. Blanche Finley is a jazz and blues singer who worked in Manchester, and she was also a political lady in that her day job was the first black women's officer in Manchester, and she worked with politicians to better the lives of black and Asian communities throughout Manchester and the Midlands. And she did a lot of work in education and politics. And in the night time, she became sprinkled with stardust and put on one of her many gowns, and off she went and sang in and around the Midlands. And she also had her own jazz club in the 1960s called the Ebony Club. And during the day, it was an education centre and a multicultural centre. And during the night, it was opened up as the Ebony Club. And Blanche and her band sang there most nights of the week. So we were very grateful to Blanche as well for giving her the gowns. And this is another of Blanche's gowns here, the green one. And she was very keen for me to know that it had butterfly sleeves. And I said, what is a butterfly sleeve, Blanche? And she said, well, when you lift your arms up when you're singing, it all floats like a butterfly. So that was Blanche. So the other part of our collections in Jazz Heritage Wales is the Ivy Benson collection. We have donated into us scrapbooks, letters, papers, documents, music, and the recollections of all the women who sang with the Ivy Benson all-girls band just prior to and during the Second World War. She was the most famous of the women band leaders. And Jenna Bailey is currently writing a book about Ivy Benson, and Jenna contributed to our Documenting Jazz conference via Canada, she was streamed in from Canada, and she was instrumental in pulling the collection together and donating it to us and reassuring all the people who had Ivy Benson memorabilia, yes, it was safe to put your collections with Jazz Heritage Wales, as they would take care of it. And we've now got all the Ivy Benson collection. So we're very grateful to Jenna and the other people who donated into us, because these collections, they are unique to Britain, and we are the only multicultural collection in the UK, so that's quite important. We come into the display case here, which is the Ivy Benson display case. And here's some of just tiny portion of the collections, and got Ivy's passport there and her scrapbooks and her life and times. And there are hundreds and hundreds of women in Britain who always referred to Ivy Benson, not as the orchestra, but as Ivy Benson's University, because that's where they got their training from, and how to play in a big band and how to interpret band charts, which is a different kettle of fish to just reading music on your music stand. So Ivy was instrumental in setting off a lot of women's careers in Britain. And again, up on the wall, we have a panel devoted to Beryl Bryden, and she was one of the singers with the Chris Barber Band, but she was a freelance singer. And Beryl is famous for the fact that she played on the first Ronnie Donegan #1 hit, Rock Island Line, right back in 1955, 1956. And we'll come to Beryl's cabinet in a minute, and I'll tell you the rest of Beryl's story. This panel on the wall is dedicated to John Godrich, and we have another display case of John Godrich, which I'll come to in a moment. So I'll tell you about him when I come to his case. Behind us, we have two more gowns from Blanche Finlay, the Manchester politician and singer. This gold one belongs to Blanche Finlay, and in total, I think Blanche gave us 17 of her gowns. And when I went to her home, I was shocked when she took me into a room which is just for the housing of her stage gowns. She opened all these sliding doors, and there was a gown, there was a pair of shoes underneath it, and there was the necklaces or earrings or whatever she was wearing to accompany the dress on the top shelf on top of the gown. And there were hundreds in there. So, you know, this was part of Blanche's persona. She said that when she went out to sing, everybody couldn't take her eyes off her. And she said that's the point. When you're a singer and you're leading in front of a band, everybody wants to see you. And she would make a point of changing twice when she sang in her gigs, so you always got treated to another posh frock after the interval. So this is a panel dedicated to Barry Stern, and we have the entire collection of Duke Ellington's recordings and the Duke Ellington's White Albums. And the White Albums were all his radio broadcasts throughout his career in America. And he broadcasted regularly, and the broadcasts were recorded, and Barry Stern, who lived in Bromley and was a dentist, every time he heard that there was another one coming out, he would hot-foot it over to New York and buy the latest one and bring it back and add it to his collection. And we are the only jazz archive in Britain that has the complete collection of Duke Ellington's recorded output, plus all his radio broadcasts as well. So they're all safe in the Jazz Archive. So behind us, here we are, we've got Beryl Bryden's display case, and we've got Beryl Bryden's dress here on the right-hand side, and another one on the left-hand side. As you can see, Beryl was a tall lady. She was about 6 foot tall, with a voice to match. And this is her display cabinet here with her dots, her music book, which she used to take round to her gigs, plonk it on the piano and say, there you go, guys, we'll do number 8 now, or we'll do number 14, and that's how they did their performances. But at the back, you can see a washboard and a picture of Beryl playing her washboard, and this is the washboard that accompanied Lonnie Donegan's #1 hit, Rock Island Line. It was the first skiffle recording that made a hit in Britain, and of course it set off the Beatles, because it was their inspiration to start their band, the Quarrymen, off with John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And they knew Beryl because they used to pass her on gigs, and sometimes they would play together, but they certainly knew Beryl because I've seen it on the documentaries, or some of the Beatles documentaries, and I remember Beryl telling me that, oh yeah, I used to meet the boys. I knew the boys. They were nice lads. So this is Beryl's display case, and because she played the washboard with her thimbles, we have all her thimbles, and I don't know what her hand is made out of, but she did have big hands as well. Beryl was big in all sorts of ways. John Godrich is an unusual man. I had a book, and there's a copy of the book here. This is the first edition, which John Godrich was notating on. It was the second edition came out. John Godrich was a fanatical collector and historian on early black blues and gospel singers in America. And his book came out called Blues, what's it called? I've forgotten the title. Blues and Gospel Music. Let's see what's on the title at the back there. Blues and Gospel, I can't read it. Blues and Gospel Music, 1902 to 1942. And John spent his whole life writing to people in America and collecting information and putting the best ever documentary book together of old black and blues musicians in America. And the astonishing story about him is that we had his book on our jazz library shelves, and it was there for 15 years. And I always thought John Godrich was obviously somebody from Mississippi or New Orleans or somewhere, and I assumed that he was an African-American man who had put this book together. And the astonishing story is that he was actually a Swansea man who worked on the docks and cycled every morning to the docks, did his job as a shipping clerk, and came home and worked on his book. And he spent 20 years working on his book, and then collected all the records that he could and put them onto reel-to-reel tapes. And I had no idea that this man was not an African-American from New Orleans or anywhere, but he was actually lived in One Wen Road in Swansea and was a Swansea shipping clerk, which sort of, when I found that out, I nearly fell on the floor. I just couldn't believe it. And here we have a small collection of his material, and this is how he set off in the very beginning to make lists of all the American bands and musicians from early days, 1902, in America. And he had a typewriter, and he would notate everything that he found and typed it up on bits of paper and put them all in a file, and that's his original file, and it ended up as this first edition of the book. And then I had, for 15 years, the second edition of the book, but there's been other editions out since, and it's world-renowned, and acknowledged as the best book on gospel and blues music in America. And to think that he was a shipping clerk living over in Wanwain is absolutely incredible. But we have his original tape recorder, and we have hundreds of his reel-to-reel tapes in the Jazz Archive as well. So the stories in this place are absolutely mind-blowing. Oh, I've just seen myself up on the wall. The Swansea Jazz Club has been a very important club in British jazz, because it's managed to survive for about 50, 60 years. And the funny story about this place is that when I was 14 and shouldn't have been in there to start with, I had my first gig in Swansea Jazz Club at the age of 14, and as it was a licensed premises, I had no idea what I was doing in there anyway, but there I went. And every week I used to play in the interval, I used to play Boogie Boogie, and I got tapped on the head and said, "Oh, what a clever little girl you are." And that was when I was 14. And I think there's a picture of me down there playing the saxophone when I was 16. And the Swansea Jazz Club is still going now, and it's run by Dave Cottle very successfully. And Dave Cottle also set up the Swansea International Jazz Festival. And he had funding for that for about 4 or 5 years, 3 or 4 years. But now funding's dried up, and what you find in the arts as well, that there's funding is drying up quite significantly. This last, well, COVID put a stop to a lot of arts activities in Wales, and it's quite sad to see the way that the arts are struggling along, and whether it gets any better or not, I have no idea. But thankfully, the Swansea Jazz Club is an important institution in Wales, and certainly within the UK, for what they've done to preserve the music. Stan Tracy is a phenomenal jazz pianist with his own particular style of playing, which is very percussive. And he was the Harold Pinter of piano players, where he left gaps, and the gaps were just as important as the notes that he actually played. And Stan Tracy was very inspired by Dylan Thomas, the poet, and then we are in the Dylan Thomas building now. He was inspired by the poetry of Dylan Thomas and Dylan Thomas's radio play, Under Milkwood. And in 1965, Stan Tracy recorded the seminal album of his career, which is still a collector's item now, of Stan Tracy and his quartet playing the compositions that Stan Tracy made for Under Milkwood, his CD. And he has the Philip Maddock, the Welsh actor, narrating the story of Under Milkwood. It's an absolutely brilliant and awe-inspiring CD and album, and we've got those in the Jazz Archive collection. And we've also got a cabinet dedicated to Stan Tracy down the end here, Mr. Tracy. And I commissioned Stan Tracy to do a piece of work for the opening of the Dylan Thomas building in 1995. And he came and performed that for us. But what we've also got is the actual manuscripts written by Stan Tracy of Dylan Thomas's Under Milkwood. And these were donated in to us by Sir Dian Hopkins, who was the National Library of Wales's librarian at one point. And we are very grateful for Sir Dian for giving us his collection. And there are 2 LPs at the back. These are the original recordings made by Dylan Thomas, narrating Under Milkwood in New York. And there was part 1 and part 2, so we've got the 2 albums there. And you can see Dylan Thomas sitting in the middle there, narrating Under Milkwood in the middle of 5 actors. who came to read the work of Under Milk Wood. I think the New York audiences didn't quite understand what they were listening to in the beginning, but by the end of the broadcast, they were all, you know, shouting and screaming and clapping, and you could hear them laughing all the way through the performance. It's a lovely recording. So we've got that in the Stan Tracy collection, but obviously the most important thing we've got are his manuscripts in his own hand. So these are absolute collector's items. And Derek Gabriel, the photographer, took this lovely picture of Stan Tracy playing the piano, but what you can't see is Stan Tracy's signature, which has faded a little bit. Stan Tracy signed one of his fingers on the piano there. So it's a multi-faceted collection. It's not just papers on shelves, it's not just records on the record shelves, but there are hundreds of stories behind the shelving. And we're also on the wall, we've got other things that inspire people to do things, you know, like poets in Swansea. We've got a lovely poem here by Dave Hughes, and he's written about the people who collect things. People like me who decided that these things have to be saved before they're thrown in skips. And it's such a lovely poem, and Dave has written, they pester neighbours, they note their memories, they translate family ramblings, they prowl around archives, they blow dust off registers and get tangled in the internet. They climb the branches of family trees and they root out parents, uncover children, haunt cemeteries, scrape lichen, gouge out moss and reveal the beloved wife. And there's another one, they discover where the pilgrims walked, where the washing was done and the stone quarried, where the welfare stood, where the dances were held and the bands that played. They list the servants at Tŷ Mawr, the names of those who went to war and those who stayed, and they know where the trains ran and when they stopped. They mark the last mine. And they wander purposefully, wondering why? Why there? Why then? And they nudge councils, needle developers, make planners revise plans. They throw us a rope from the past, reminding us who we are, and they make life rafts. And that's by the Swansea poet, Dave Hughes, which is absolute joy. He's a very good poet, very good poet. And these are some of the music machines that we have in the jazz collection. This is our oldest one. This is a 1905 Edison phonograph, and it plays cylinders. This was the first ever recorded sound. So before that, you had to go out and find your own music, either play it or listen to it, because before this machine was invented, you played your own music and made your own noise, or went out and found it. And some of the other things we've got are an old wartime radio, a GEC radio, and this was found in a basement in my house when we bought an old ramshackle house and found this old thing in the basement, and we eventually got it working. And the first thing it played was wartime music, and we all freaked out because we thought it was some sort of poltergeist in there or something. But so that's safe now in the archives, and we've also got an old player called an Academy 78, which is not very familiar with, but most of my generation are familiar with this one. That's right, it's a Pi Accuphone stereo record player, full of plastic, I think, probably. And some of these last ones over here. This top one here, a 1937 HMV radiogram, that came out of our house as well, as it belonged to my granddad. So my granddad is going back before 1900, so that it's within living memory, but it's astonishing how old these machines are now. This is 1937. This was his master's voice, HMV, where you had the little dog listening to the music coming out of the big horn at the back. But this was only allowed to be played on a Saturday, On the Sunday, my gran locked the front room with the piano and the HMV radiogram in it, because nobody was allowed to make any noise at all on the Sabbath. So that didn't stop me and my brother playing jazz. He was a drummer and I played the piano. So that is some of the collections that we've got in Jazz Heritage Wales. Obviously we've got a lot more than that, and we are very grateful to the University of Wales, Trinity St David's, for giving us this lovely home, and we are working now to consolidate what we've got here and to come up with a plan of action for the next 5 years so that we can continue to keep the collection safe. So thank you, University, and the City of Swansea as well.